You don't belong near our equipment. Step away, now. Rowan didn't even look up. She kept turning the socket wrench, smooth, silent, like the insult hadn't even touched her. The air shifted. A wrench clattered to the floor nearby. Someone swore under their breath. The others watched, uneasy, uncertain why this quiet woman hadn't walked away already. Then she stood, her jumpsuit caught on a jagged edge of metal. The back ripped, just enough. The room froze. On her spine was a tattoo no one was supposed to see. No one alive was supposed to wear it. Last warning, she said quietly. Say that again and I'll remind you what Crimson 17 did to people who underestimated them. But they didn't back off. Not yet. Because they still thought she was just a mechanic. They hadn't figured out who she really was. And when the general walked in 5 minutes later, everything changed. Tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe to Veteran Biker for more stories they tried to erase. You won't believe what happens next. The sun baked the tarmac of Desert Ridge with a brutal indifference, the kind of dry heat that didn't just cook you, it hollowed you. The humming of industrial generators echoed like distant growls across the motor pool, broken only by occasional shouts from the maintenance crews or the clanking of dropped tools. No one paid much attention to the woman crouched behind the battered Gentech 6A unit at the far end of the bay. She wore a faded tan jumpsuit, sleeves tied around her waist, tank top darkened by sweat and dust. From behind, she looked unremarkable, just another contracted technician assigned to keep the lifeblood of electricity flowing through the outpost. But the way she moved said otherwise, precise, focused, like someone who had done this under pressure, under fire. Private Granger leaned against a fuel barrel, tossing a socket wrench between his hands as he eyed the woman with a smirk. Bet you she doesn't even know what a load balancer does, he muttered to Corporal Diaz, who chewed on a toothpick and squinted toward her. She probably just Googles this crap, Diaz replied. Civilian hires, pure affirmative action. Can't even get a uniform right. She doesn't talk to anyone, added Luke, the youngest of them. Never eats at the mess, always working on something, like she's trying to prove something. Trying too hard, Diaz nodded. Probably one of those wannabe war hero types. Spent a year at some support post in Germany and now thinks she's Rambo. The woman didn't look up. She had a small flathead in her left hand, a voltage probe in her right, and was working methodically through a control panel that half the crew had written off as fried beyond salvage. A low whistle sounded as she manually bridged a damaged capacitor with a bypass wire and triggered a calibration sequence. The generator stuttered, coughed, and then roared to life. Steady, clean, and angry, the noise jolted the trio into silence. Then, without warning, the woman sat back on her heels, pulling the tank top away from her damp back to wipe her face. In that moment, her spine arched and her back turned just enough for the fabric to shift. A glint of black ink emerged beneath her shoulder blades, then more. Granger's face froze. Diaz leaned forward, squinting. "What the hell is that?" The tattoo, just visible through the damp shirt, ran in a clean vertical line down the center of her spine. A crimson sword snapped in half across a skeletal mask, haloed by 4 jagged lightning bolts. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't decorative. It looked like something burned into memory more than skin. Luke paled. "I've seen that. Somewhere. I swear to God." Granger blinked. "That's not just some ink, that's military." "No," Diaz said slowly, stepping forward, voice lowered. "That's from the Crimson team." Luke nearly dropped his water bottle. "You mean that ghost team they said got wiped in Al Hudra? That's just a rumor." Diaz stared. "No, man. My cousin did time in PsyOps. Said there were files sealed tighter than Fort Knox about that group. They weren't supposed to exist. That symbol's theirs." Behind them, the woman stood and slung her tools into a canvas bag without looking at the crowd gathering near the bay entrance. She knew. By the time Rowan Hale exited the bay, the air felt heavier than the desert heat. Conversations died when she passed. Eyes followed her, not with lust or curiosity, but wariness, recognition, and fear. The image of her tattoo had already made its rounds. Somehow, in less than 10 minutes, a blurred snapshot of her spine had found its way into the battalion's internal chat thread, captioned only with "Spinal Sigil Confirmed." Beneath it, a dozen comments lit up. "That's Crimson 17, that's not a joke," but they were all declared Kia in Al Hudra, 2011. "Only if you believe what CENTCOM puts in the press kits. I swear my uncle said one of them was pulled out. Alive." But then they vanished. The mess hall that evening was unusually quiet. Forks clinked against metal trays, but no one sat near the corner table where Rowan nursed a black coffee. Her jumpsuit was zipped to the top again, no ink in sight, but it was too late for hiding. Private Luke kept glancing over. "Why isn't anyone saying anything to her?" Diaz whispered. "Because no one wants to be the one who pisses off a dead soldier who came back." Across the base, in an office fortified with reinforced glass and screens that never slept, Major General Thomas Decker stood frozen, holding a printed still image from the security feed. He had called it in himself. His aide had tried to tell him not to bother, just another technician, just another day. But when Decker caught sight of her in the generator bay, something visceral had seized him. It wasn't just the tattoo, it was her. 13 years ago, the Crimson 17 convoy had rolled into a valley in the Al Hudra region under the burning sun, never to return. Only wreckage was recovered, scorched metal, blood-slick sand, a single torn badge retrieved by a drone, and a report stamped "No survivors," case sealed. Decker hadn't written the report, but he'd signed off on it. And now, looking at the image, the sword snapped across the skeletal mask, those jagged lightning bolts, his stomach churned. "She shouldn't be here," he whispered. His aide looked up. "Sir?" Decker said nothing, just stared at the still image of the technician standing beside the generator she had resurrected with nothing more than raw instinct and fire in her hands. The war was over, but somehow part of it had survived, and it had walked right back into his command. 3 weeks before the tattoo made its silent declaration to the base, Rowan Hale had arrived without ceremony. No welcoming committee, no salute, just a clipboard, a duffel bag, and a work order stamped contractor. Technical support. She wore the same expression then as she did now, one of quiet resolve, neither hostile nor warm. Her face bore the hallmarks of someone used to heat and grit. Light crow's feet hinted at more nights under desert sky than any civilian should have endured. Her dark blonde hair was tightly braided and tucked beneath a faded ball cap, and her stride, though unhurried, was purposeful. The first impression she gave wasn't memorable. That in itself was the trick. Rowan was assigned to Section C, the oldest, dustiest part of the Desert Ridge maintenance compound. Her daily duties were limited to diagnose, repair, and optimize, which in most civilian contexts meant plug-in diagnostics, replace fuses, go home. But that wasn't how she worked. She didn't bring a tablet. She brought tools. Within 72 hours, she had rerouted the failing junction box in Sector 3 to boost backup capacity by 15%, silenced an alarm system that had falsely triggered for months, and somehow revived a transmission module the mechanics had already labeled for scrap. Yet no one spoke to her. It wasn't that she was unpleasant, she was just unavailable. In the break room, she sat at the far end with a paper cup of black coffee. No sugar, no words. She didn't socialize, didn't ask for help, and never offered advice unless directly requested. In a world where rank and camaraderie bled into daily culture, Rowan stood apart, not out of pride, but necessity. And that's what bothered them most. "Who the hell does she think she is?" Granger muttered one afternoon, slamming a wrench down harder than necessary as he watched Rowan lift the lid of a secondary circuit box. "She's acting like this place is her lab," Diaz scoffed, pulling his cap lower over his eyes. "Probably got canned from some aerospace company. Now thinks she's giving back to the troops by fixing ancient gear." "I heard she asked for this assignment," Luke said, more curious than cruel. "Like, specifically requested Desert Ridge." Diaz snorted. "Then she's crazier than she looks. Maybe she's just tired of civilians," Granger added. "Wouldn't blame her. Hell, she probably just wants to be around real warriors and soak up the vibe." "That's not what I see," Luke muttered. "She moves like someone who's already seen war." They all went quiet for a beat. Then Diaz chuckled darkly. "Please, what war? Her knees don't even have sand creases." But privately, even Diaz couldn't ignore the way she handled live wiring with bare confidence, the way she made calls without consulting any digital manual, the way her eyes scanned a broken board like she already saw the invisible map of damage. There was experience behind her silence, but no one knew where it came from. And because they didn't know, they filled in the gaps with mockery. That was safer. Rowan never corrected their assumptions. She didn't flinch when Diaz snickered as she walked by, didn't respond when Granger dropped a toolbox too close to her boots by accident, and didn't react when her locker was mysteriously reassigned to a broken unit without ventilation. She simply moved. From mess hall to workshop, from comm station to generator bay, she executed her duties like clockwork. Every bolt turned, every board replaced, every system revived. No fanfare, no applause. Just results. And that unnerved them more than anger ever could. "Why doesn't she complain?" Granger asked one morning as he shoved a box of old capacitors off the work table she had claimed the night before. "We've iced her out of half the workspace. She hasn't said a word." "She's probably writing everything down for her contractor review," Diaz said with a sneer. "Bet she's trying to get someone demoted, make a name for herself as the hero civilian." "I dunno," Luke said, more hesitant now. "Maybe she's just used to people treating her like that." The room fell quiet. That thought that maybe she'd been through worse was not comforting. Still, they didn't let up. Rowan's requests for replacement circuit sheets were delayed. Her toolbox was accidentally misplaced twice. Once, someone even poured water into her voltage meter pouch. The kind of sabotage that wasn't dangerous, but deeply personal. She never retaliated. She never even acknowledged it. But behind the silence, there were cracks they couldn't see. At night, Rowan sat alone in the far corner of the barracks lounge, watching the desert wind sweep dust across the glass. Her fingers traced the rim of a ceramic cup with the same precision she used to trace current through coils. Sometimes, in the reflection of the window, her own eyes startled her. The base reminded her too much of Al-Hudra, the same scorching light, the same static air, the same faint taste of dust and gun oil. Except this time there were no teammates, no brothers, no radio check-ins. Just her, still breathing, still unknown. When she walked through the motor pool, mechanics went quiet. Some nodded politely. Most looked away. To them, she was just a misplaced cog in a finely tuned war machine, one that didn't belong, didn't salute, didn't bleed regulation green. She was tolerated. Until one afternoon, that tattoo broke the rules of silence. It started with a clipboard. A simple maintenance log, dropped off on Rowan's bench during her off shift, carried a red-marked note in the corner. Clearance level pending verification. She frowned at it, not because of what it said, she had worked under restrictions before, but because of where it came from. It wasn't the usual tech office stamp, it came directly from base admin. She set it aside, maybe a clerical update, maybe routine. But the next morning, the calibration room required a badge scan. Her contractor badge blinked red. Restricted area, the automated voice chirped. Rowan waited, swiped again, still red. The technician manning the desk, a young sergeant with a nervous posture, glanced at her apologetically. "Sorry, ma'am, new system protocol. You'll need to get reauthorized through section security. I've worked in this room for 2 weeks. I know, but your clearance just disappeared. System-wide." She didn't argue, just turned and walked out. That afternoon she found her toolbox, the one she'd locked the night before, opened. Her instruments were untouched but rearranged, not carelessly, intentionally. The torque wrench was moved exactly 2 inches from its usual slot. A voltmeter turned upside down, her notes folder flipped backward, cover peeled open. Rowan exhaled slowly, not in panic, but in confirmation. Someone had gone looking. Later that evening in the base comms building, Corporal Diaz stood outside the admin room, arms crossed, waiting for his moment. When his superior officer stepped out for coffee, Diaz slipped in and left a folded envelope on the desk. No name, just a printed file inside, screenshots of Rowan's badge photo, timestamps from her system logins, and a short, typed note. Civilian contractor Rowan Hale has bypassed several access protocols normally reserved for former military personnel. Recommend verification of service history. Behavior indicates possible impersonation or unsanctioned field experience. Request formal inquiry. He didn't dislike her per se, he just didn't trust her, she didn't belong, and more importantly, she never tried to... The inquiry moved faster than Rowan expected. Within 24 hours she was summoned politely, but with that sharp undertone only military admin clerks could perfect, to the personnel office in the East Wing. The waiting room was sterile, paper white and cold, despite the desert sun outside. A civilian contractor named Lewis, all nervous smiles and deliberate phrasing, greeted her with a clipboard and a forced chuckle. "Miss Hale," he said, pronouncing it like he was unsure whether she was Miss, Mrs. or something else entirely. "We're just doing a standard contractor data sync. New database protocols. Real pain in the neck." Rowan took the clipboard without a word. It was an authorization form, standard language until the bottom half. Military service history, check 1, active duty reserve, never served other. She stared at it for a long time. Then she checked other. When Lewis reviewed it, his eyes darted up quickly. "Would you mind elaborating?" Rowan said nothing. Behind closed doors, her file was opened by higher hands. The admin system showed exactly what it was designed to show. Rowan Hale. Civilian, contractor, technical certifications verified, background clear, no military record, no DD 214, no previous ranks, no deployments, no commendations, nothing. "She's clean," one officer noted, tapping the tablet. "Too clean. This looks like a synthetic profile." The base commander's assistant frowned. "You think she's a plant? Unlikely. But she's either hiding something or someone erased it." From that moment forward, the base's attitude toward Rowan shifted. Subtly at first, then sharper. Her name disappeared from shared task lists. Her access to secondary maintenance bays was revoked. Her radio tag was deregistered from vehicle checkouts. Techs who once greeted her with nods now avoided eye contact. Even the supply clerk, a retiree who had once shared his lunch with her, now shrugged when she asked about her delayed replacement parts. "Back-ordered," he said flatly, without looking up. Rowan didn't fight it. She simply adapted. She brought her own tools from off-base, began rerouting her repair paths around the locked-out zones. What couldn't be fixed through official channels, she mended in silence, alone, after hours. But silence has weight, and even the strongest can feel it settle in their bones when surrounded by a system designed to ignore them out of existence. For the second time in her life, Rowan Hale was being erased. And this time, they weren't even trying to hide it. The desert heat had shifted. It wasn't just the temperature, though it climbed mercilessly past 112 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-morning. It was the air inside the compound, heavier, tighter, like everything was holding its breath. Rowan Hale moved through it like she always had, with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled to the elbows, boots scuffed and functional, but the pressure around her had changed. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Tools she requested never arrived. Her badge was flagged at nearly every checkpoint now, even for places where she had worked unimpeded just days earlier. Still, she didn't flinch. But something else did. The base itself seemed to bristle at her presence. At breakfast, a few soldiers rose and left their table when she sat 3 seats away. Outside the mess, she found her name crossed out on the equipment sign-up sheet, a different name scrawled over it in red marker, not cleared. And in the corridor near the machine shop, the air vent above her locker was whirring louder than usual, high-pitched, irregular, not in sync with the rest. When she paused beneath it, she could hear the faint click of a phone camera shutter. Rowan said nothing. She had said nothing for 13 years, but that didn't mean she didn't notice. It was only a matter of time before someone pushed further. The push came on a Thursday. A critical generator module near the comms bunker had shorted out, again, and Rowan was assigned to it. No one volunteered to assist. She arrived at 13, alone, toolbox in hand, sweat already forming along her collar. The gen power unit was sun-bleached and smoking at the edges, a tangle of wiring beneath its vent grid. Rowan dropped to her knees, opened the lower casing, and got to work, back exposed, hair tied up, jumpsuit unzipped halfway, and sleeves tied around her waist like always. She didn't notice it at first, but something about the jumpsuit felt off, looser around the spine, almost tugging. When she shifted position, the zipper slid just a little more than it should have. Another movement, a reach for the inner socket, and the fabric caught on the hot casing's edge and tore. Clean across the back, a long, sudden rip. The desert wind pushed through the tear, flipping open the fabric, and there it was, clear, centered, unmistakable. The tattoo. Diaz was the first to see it. He had been walking across the courtyard with Granger and Luke when he caught a glimpse of movement from the generator bay, just enough to see Rowan's back arched as she adjusted a relay box. And then he stopped cold. "Wait," he muttered. Granger turned. "What?" Diaz held up a hand, eyes narrowing. "Look at her back." Luke followed his gaze and dropped his wrench. The fabric of Rowan's jumpsuit hung open, flapping slightly in the wind. Across her spine was a stark black and red tattoo, weathered by time but unmistakably deliberate. A sword, broken in the middle, speared through a grinning skeletal mask. Around it, 4 jagged lightning bolts like claws. Diaz swore under his breath. That can't be. Holy sh... Granger cut himself off. Luke stumbled back a step, face pale. "I saw that in a documentary. A frame. Just one frame. They called it Crimson Sigil. Said it belonged to some ghost unit, Crimson 17 or something like that." Diaz looked rattled. "That unit's not real. That whole report was blacklined. The Pentagon denied it even existed." "Yeah?" Granger said, voice dry. "Then why the hell is it tattooed across her spine?" No one answered. By the time Rowan stood up, tied her jumpsuit around her waist again, and wiped her hands with a rag, the 3 of them had already backed away like they'd seen a ghost. No words, just wide eyes and dry throats. She didn't look at them, but she knew they had seen it. Within 20 minutes, a photo surfaced in the internal group chat. Low angle, slightly blurred, but still legible. The caption was short, "She's one of them." Comments exploded beneath it. "No way!" Crimson 17 was wiped out. "I heard only one body was never recovered." "Her! What's she doing here? If that's real, why hasn't anyone said anything?" And then the final comment, from an account tagged OpsOps Internal. usually a joke tag for someone anonymous, because some ghosts walk among us, and we were never meant to know. The air across Desert Ridge shifted again, but this time it wasn't suspicion, it was fear. Major General Thomas Decker didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in paperwork, in strategy, in precise execution. His office was immaculate, his schedule tracked down to the minute, and his command style, though feared, was considered one of the most effective across the Southwestern Division. But that afternoon, as his convoy turned into the Desert Ridge perimeter, someone shattered all of that. He had only intended to make a brief inspection, shake hands, observe logistics, nod through another lukewarm briefing about energy consumption and spare parts procurement. The kind of trip that made command feel visible, but stayed clear of disruption. The generator bay wasn't even on his route, but as the Humvee slowed near the southern compound, his eyes caught a figure in motion. A woman crouched behind a GenPower unit, sleeves tied around her waist, sweat staining her collar, dark blonde hair tucked up in a dusty cap. Something about her posture froze him. She stood just for a second and adjusted her jumpsuit. That was when he saw it, the tattoo. He didn't breathe, he didn't blink. The world around him dulled, radio chatter went mute. The desert wind fell away, and all he could see was the black and red insignia carved into memory, the fractured sword piercing the skeletal mask. Lightning bolts like claws tearing from its center. 13 years. 13 years since Al-Hudra. 13 years since Crimson 17 vanished off the grid, buried in classified wreckage and silence. And now the mark of the dead was standing in broad daylight, soldering circuits in a motor pool. "Stop the vehicle," Decker ordered. The driver hesitated, but the Humvee rolled to a halt. The aide in the back turned to speak, but Decker was already unbuckling his seatbelt, hand braced against the window frame, eyes locked on the woman. She hadn't seen him. She kept working, unaware of the tremor she had sent through a 4-star general. "Sir?" his aide asked. Decker didn't respond. He was back in Al-Hudra, in the dust, in the smoke, in the final drone feed showing a column of fire and silence where there should have been a return call. Crimson 17 was gone. No black box, no bodies. Just one helmet camera, fried and cut short, and a coded signal they never cracked. But this was impossible. And Decker had long since learned the impossible usually meant someone lied. Back at the command office, Decker moved like a man possessed. His boots struck the concrete with precision as he climbed the stairs to the intelligence wing, bypassing 2 protocol checkpoints without waiting for clearance. His aide struggled to keep pace, gripping a tablet that bounced awkwardly against his chest. "Initiate archive access," Decker barked as he entered the secure briefing room. "I want full retrieval of Crimson 17 files, everything marked from 2011 to 2013. No filters, no redactions." The staff sergeant manning the terminal hesitated. "Sir, those files are restricted at—" "I signed the original authorization," Decker snapped. "That makes me part of the chain. Enter the override." The room fell into a tense hush. The sergeant complied, fingers flying across the keyboard. One by one the screens lit up, topographical scans, satellite images, debrief logs with half-blackened lines, and then personnel records. He scrolled quickly. Names flashed past: Cortez, Nugent, Farris, Lynn, Dawes, all marked Kia, but one name stood out, near the bottom, faded, almost skipped. Lieutenant Rowan M. Hale, status, Mia, presumed Kia, last visual, Operation Scimitar, Al-Hudra, 342, Zulu body unrecovered. Signal lost. Recovery operation denied due to hostile conditions. Decker leaned forward. "Bring up her service file," he said, voice low. The system hesitated, buffering. Then Error 402, record unavailable, requested file purged or relocated. He stared at the blinking error code. "Who purged her file?" he asked. The sergeant looked pale. I don't know, sir. There's no log. No trace of administrative action. That's not supposed to be possible." Decker's jaw clenched. "Pull her contractor file, the one she's working under now." Moments later, a different screen appeared. The current base systems profile: Rowan Hale, civilian contractor. No military history. Background clear. "Bullshit," he muttered. He stood, hands braced on the edge of the table, eyes darting between two realities, one that remembered her as a soldier lost in fire, and one that insisted she had never worn the uniform. Someone had scrubbed her, carefully, deliberately. But they had missed one thing: the tattoo. It wasn't just a symbol. It was never meant for the public, never published or leaked. That insignia, the broken sword, the skeletal mask, the lightning, had been designed by Crimson 17 themselves. It was worn under armor, between shoulder blades, inked in quiet rebellion as a badge of unity. Only someone in that unit would know the exact angles, the exact spacing, the jagged count, and she had it, burned into her spine. That meant she was there, which meant someone had lied. Decker straightened, eyes narrowing. "Find her," he ordered, quietly, no alerts. "I want to speak to Rowan Hale myself." The sergeant nodded, visibly shaken. As the room emptied, Decker remained, staring at the frozen personnel photo of a younger, blood-smeared woman, half-shadowed in dust, eyes fierce beneath a cracked helmet. He had once signed her off as dead. Now she was back. And the question that haunted him more than any other was, why didn't she tell anyone? He found her sitting alone behind the mess hall, exactly where the desert dropped off into the lower dunes. The sun was bruising the sky in shades of burnt orange, and the air had cooled just enough for silence to settle like dust. He approached slowly, his gait uneven, one leg stiff with age and shrapnel. His uniform was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled. Nothing about him looked official, but the way he walked, the way he stopped short when he saw her face, said everything. "Rowan," he said quietly, almost like testing the name against the wind. She didn't turn, but her jaw tensed. "I thought you were dead," the man said again, more firmly this time. His voice was older now, but there was a crack inside it, a place where memory had never fully healed. "We all did," Rowan spoke without looking up. "You saw the footage." "Yeah," he nodded. "We all did." She let the silence breathe before she turned to him. "You're limping, too proud for a cane, too stubborn to stay retired." Her eyes scanned his face, recognition tugging at corners of her mouth. "Sergeant Keller." He gave a quiet laugh. "Still remember?" "I remember all of them," she said, "even the ones whose bodies we never found." Keller didn't speak for a while. He simply sat beside her on the bench, groaning slightly as his knees protested. For a long minute neither said anything. The desert stretched before them, vast and indifferent. A lizard skittered across the sand. "You didn't reach out," he finally said. 13 years. We buried ghosts without names. You could have..." "No," she cut in, soft but absolute. "I couldn't." He looked over, searching her expression. "Why?" "Because they told me to disappear," she replied. "Because after the dust cleared, after the fire stopped, they said if I surfaced it would raise questions about what really happened. About how the mission failed, about who sent us in without extraction clearance." Keller swore under his breath. "They offered you a cover?" "They erased me," Rowan said. "And I let them." Keller exhaled, his shoulders slumping as he stared at the horizon. "They erased you to protect themselves. Not the mission, not the rest of us." Rowan said nothing. "You were the best of us," he continued, voice rough, "and they buried that in silence." She shook her head. "I wasn't the best. I was just the one who survived." He looked at her, long and hard. You dragged Cortez out of a burning convoy under sniper fire. You rerouted comms in the middle of a jammed satellite op. You volunteered for the tunnel breach while half of us hesitated. Don't rewrite your own story, Rowan. She blinked slowly, trying to keep her breath even. The wind picked up and carried a sliver of sand across the bench between them. I tried to rebuild a life, she said. Contract work, quiet bases, places where people don't ask too many questions, but it always catches up. The way I move, the way I work, something gives it away. Because you were forged for more than hiding. Rowan chuckled without humor. And yet here I am, fixing generators in the desert until your back betrayed you. That drew the first real smile from her. Faint, but real. Damn zipper. Keller leaned forward, elbows on his knees. They'll come knocking now, you know that, right? Decker's seen it, probably half the base by now. You won't stay invisible, she nodded. I know. Then what? He asked. I don't know, she replied. It's been so long since I was allowed to wear my own name. A long pause stretched between them. Then, in a softer voice, Keller said, You're not the only one. I've met 3 others over the years, scattered, hiding in plain sight. One runs a climbing gear shop in Idaho. One coaches boxing in El Paso. None of them ever talked. Not really. But the way they watched the exits in every room said enough. Rowan's throat tightened. You weren't forgotten, Keller added gently. Just silenced. There's a difference. She swallowed hard. And what do I do with that now? He turned to her fully. Maybe it's time someone spoke. Really spoke. Rowan looked down at her calloused hands. I don't even know what I'd say. Keller stood, the desert wind tugging at his loose sleeves. Start with this. I was there. I lived. And I remember everything. He paused. And then remind them that you did too. The announcement went out that morning without much ceremony. Maintenance refresher briefing, all units. Motor pool bay 1 to 0, 900 hours. Mandatory. No one questioned it. These briefings happened every few weeks. Usually dry, technical, filled with redundant protocols about tool safety and surge protections. It was an excuse to half listen while sipping burnt coffee. But this one felt different the moment they stepped in. The projector was already on, casting a faint blue glow on the wall. The benches had been cleaned. Someone had even swept the floor. And at the far end of the bay stood Rowan Hale, clipboard in one hand, jumpsuit zipped high, boots polished for the first time anyone could remember. Luke nudged Granger. Why is she running the session? Granger rolled his eyes. Because command's too cheap to bring in someone with a real uniform. Diaz stayed quiet, arms crossed as he took a spot near the back. The noise died quickly when Rowan stepped forward. She didn't speak right away, just looked across the faces in front of her, soldiers she had walked past for weeks, ignored by, whispered about, sabotaged by. She clicked the projector remote. A blueprint of the Gen Power 9A flashed onto the screen. We're going to walk through power redistribution protocols, she said, voice steady. I'll be demoing a sequence used during hot ops redeployment scenarios, the kind where backup fails and the primary grid is compromised. Most of you will never need it. A few chuckled. But if you do, she continued, you'll want to remember every second of what I show you. The tone cut through the room like a cold blade. She moved through the diagrams with precision, marking common fault zones, emphasizing grounding loops, rerouting sequences, emergency manual overrides. It was clear, fast, and unlike anything they had been taught. Halfway through, Sergeant Riggs from engineering leaned forward. That sequence, that's not in the Army handbook. No, it's not, Rowan said. It was tested in theater. Under fire, Crimson 17 drafted it after we lost 4 men in a convoy blackout. The air went still. She let the words hang. Granger furrowed his brow. Wait, you just said... Rowan turned calm and zipped her jumpsuit down just enough to pull the collar aside. The neckline dropped just enough to show the upper tip of the tattoo, the jagged lightning bolt. Gasps rippled through the room. Diaz stepped forward slowly. "You're not just a tech." "No," she said softly. "I'm not." A low murmur spread like wildfire. Several soldiers stood, unsure whether to remain seated or step back. One sergeant instinctively reached for his comms, then hesitated. No one wanted to be the one to sound the alarm without orders. The tattoo on Rowan's back was no longer just a rumor. It was real, and it was speaking. "I didn't come here to hide," she said, raising her voice just enough to cut through the whispers. "But I didn't come here to be found either." Diaz blinked, his expression torn between disbelief and something dangerously close to guilt. Granger looked rattled. Luke looked terrified. "You were in Crimson -17, Riggs finally said, almost in awe. "But they said you were all gone. There were no survivors." Rowan nodded. "That's what they wanted everyone to believe." Before anyone could respond, the bay doors creaked open at the far end. Boots echoed against concrete. All eyes turned. Major General Thomas Decker entered the room without ceremony, without warning, and without his usual entourage. His face was stone, his eyes locked on Rowan. The room stood at attention instinctively, even those who weren't technically under his direct command. Something in the air shifted, tension knotted in every chest. Rowan didn't move. Decker stepped forward, slow and deliberate, eyes never leaving hers. "You said you weren't here to be found," he said calmly, "but I think it's time you stop pretending you're invisible." "I never pretended," Rowan replied. "You did that for me." There was no malice in her voice, just truth. Decker stopped a few feet from her. "I signed off on your death certificate. Your file was sealed, your name scrubbed, and now you're standing in front of 50 soldiers teaching them systems that don't exist in any manual. They exist where it counts," she said, "in fire, in loss, in memory." A pause, thick, electric. Decker looked at the stunned soldiers. "You all want answers." No one said a word. He turned back to Rowan. "Then let's give them some." He stepped aside, a gesture not of rank, but of recognition. Rowan looked at him, then slowly faced the room again. "This tattoo," she said, placing her fingers lightly against her upper spine, "wasn't meant to be seen. It wasn't inked for pride or style or rebellion. It was how we found each other, in the dark, in smoke, in the worst moments when radios died and orders meant nothing." She met their eyes, one by one. "I was the convoy engineer for Crimson 17. We weren't ghosts. We were soldiers. We bled for objectives no one would ever report. And when the mission failed, they didn't just bury our bodies, they buried our names." Silence. Then, one voice from the back, Riggs again, barely above a whisper, "Not anymore." For a moment, no one moved. The last words hung in the air, echoing off steel and silence. Rowan stood steady beneath the weight of their gazes. She didn't shrink. She didn't boast. She simply existed, fully, finally, as herself. Decker, however, remained still for a different reason. Something in her voice, not the words, not the posture, but the tone, low and gravel-worn, pulled at a part of his memory he'd long since bricked over. A voice in smoke, in pain, in blood. He stepped back slowly, as if something behind his eyes was unraveling. "Crimson 17, he repeated quietly. "Convoy Bravo, third vehicle, Humvee Unit 3A. His gaze locked on Rowan. "You were the one driving the munitions crawler." She nodded once. "That's right." Decker's face changed, not with shock, but with recognition. Deep, unsettling physical recognition. "You crawled through fire to reach me," he said. "I was trapped in the overturned MRAP. My leg was shattered," Rowan finished. Pinned under the breech frame, his hand instinctively touched the back of his thigh, an old wound, long faded but never forgotten. "And you cut me out," he said, almost in disbelief, "with wire cutters. While rounds were flying overhead, I dislocated your hip to pull you clear. You blacked out before I got you to the evac trench." The room was frozen. The general, the man whose name carried weight across half the Western Command, was no longer addressing a technician. He was standing face to face with the ghost who saved his life. Rowan looked down for a moment. "You were the only one who didn't scream." Decker's throat worked. "I never knew who it was. They said you died in the fire 10 minutes later. They needed someone to die," Rowan replied. "It made the cleanup easier." Decker's breath came slow and shallow. He wasn't just remembering now, he was reliving it. The smoke, the searing heat, the weight of twisted metal crushing his leg, and then her, the silhouette through the fire, not a medic, not a comms officer. A ghost in the flames, pulling him out by sheer will. "You saved me," he said again, as if the words were too large to believe. Rowan met his eyes, and I watched the dust cover us both. A long silence fell between them, surrounded by soldiers who no longer whispered, no longer speculated. They simply bore witness. "You never tried to contact me," Decker said finally, quieter now. "All these years. Why?" "I didn't know who I pulled," Rowan replied. "Helmet was off, face was burned. You never spoke after the first scream." Her voice softened. "And even if I had known, what would I have said?" "Hi, I'm the soldier you erased." Decker flinched. "They told me I would be helping preserve national unity," Rowan continued, "that the mission's failure couldn't be public, that it would compromise operations in the entire quadrant. I was 28. I'd just buried half my team. I said yes, because I thought I owed it to someone." "You owed it to yourself to live," Decker murmured. "I did, quietly, alone." Decker looked around, at the men and women watching, at the young soldiers who had mocked her weeks before, and now stood in stunned silence. Then he looked back at her. "I can't undo what they did," he said, "but I can start to unbury it." Rowan didn't respond right away. Her eyes searched his face, not for apology, but for conviction. "You still have pull," she said. He nodded. "I do." "And you still sign things." "I do." Her voice dropped. "Then make it count." He straightened his posture. "I will." No salute passed between them, no formality. Just a quiet acknowledgement between two soldiers who had once been written off as disposable, and now stood together, still alive, in the open. The official memo arrived 3 days later. No fanfare, no headlines, just a simple line added to the daily base report. Rowan M. Hale, contractor ID 43911th, granted full honorary veteran status under Article 2.7. Internal citation classified, but everyone already knew. By the time the memo posted, the air around the compound had shifted entirely. Where once there had been distance, now there was deference. Respect. Quiet understanding. No one dared call her civilian anymore. She didn't walk alone in the motor pool. Soldiers fell into step beside her now. Without speaking, without asking, her name began showing up on shift rosters again. This time not scribbled out, but highlighted. Someone even welded a nameplate to her workbench in fresh steel. Hale, TF Crimson. She found it one morning and said nothing, just brushed her fingers across the metal and got back to work. The mess hall changed too. One afternoon, Luke walked up with a tray and sat across from her without asking. No nervous glances, no stammered apology, just 2 cups of coffee and a quiet, "You were right about that capacitor trick. Cut our load time in half." She nodded. "It holds better if you cross-ground the fused junction." Granger came by later. He didn't sit, but he left a small envelope beside her tray. Inside was a clean, rethreaded voltage meter, the same one they'd ruined her first week. No words, just a nod. Even Diaz, once her loudest critic, gave a silent salute one morning as she passed. It was awkward, crooked, not regulation, but it was real. The biggest change came at the briefing room 2 days later. tucked at the end of a long security update, General Decker cleared his throat and turned to the audience of young engineers, drone techs and signal operators. "There are stories we don't tell," he began, "not because they're untrue, but because someone decided they were inconvenient." A few soldiers stiffened. He let the silence hang. "But every system, even this one, has its ghosts. And sometimes those ghosts walk among us, fixing things no one else can, teaching lessons no manual ever will." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Rowan was standing by the exit, arms crossed, eyes locked on the floor, but she heard it all. Later that night, when the desert winds turned sharp and the stars blinked with desert clarity, she sat by herself at the edge of the loading dock. Boots off, socks dirty, a small tin cup of cold coffee in her hands. A shadow approached, Keller again, limping as always. "Didn't expect a parade," she said without looking up. "You'd hate a parade." "True." He sat beside her and exhaled slowly. "They know now," he said. Rowan nodded. "Some of it. Enough." She looked at him. "Think they'll remember?" "Only the right ones will," he said. "The others never mattered." 2 weeks later, a fresh batch of recruits arrived. Young, eager, still shiny around the eyes. Rowan watched them from a distance, leaning against the wall near the tool depot. They joked too loud, walked too fast, carried themselves like they knew the whole world. She remembered what that felt like, to believe that training could prepare you for the unexpected. That rank made you ready for chaos. That loyalty could be assumed, instead of earned through fire. One of the recruits dropped his toolkit, scattering fuses across the floor. The others laughed. Rowan stepped forward, crouched, and helped him gather them. "Thanks, ma'am," he said sheepishly, not recognizing her. "You assigned to our squad?" She handed him the last fuse. "No, but I've walked your path before." He blinked. "Were you an instructor?" "No," she said, "just someone who remembers what it's like to carry gear you're not ready for." The words landed heavier than expected. He straightened up, uncertain, then offered a small salute. She returned it, barely a nod, but enough. Later that day, she entered the west hangar and found a young tech struggling to stabilize a feedback loop on a damaged console. Sparks flared, frustration boiled. Rowan rolled up her sleeves and knelt beside him. "Mind if I try something?" she asked. He moved aside, silently grateful. She took one glance, twisted 2 wires with a subtle flick of the wrist, and the console hummed to life. The tech stared. "What the hell?" "Sometimes it's not about strength," she said. "It's about knowing where things are likely to break." He would remember that for years. Rowan didn't return to the command room again. She didn't need to. Her recognition wasn't hung on walls or printed in certificates. It lived in the subtle shifts, the quiet nods, the silence before her name was spoken, the tools that now stayed exactly where she left them. But the most unexpected moment came the following Sunday. As the sun crested over the ridge, the base gathered for morning roll call. Not mandatory, not ceremonial, just a routine assembly. Decker stood as always, reading notes, issuing brief orders. But before dismissing the crowd, he cleared his throat. "One final note," he said. "We have a new appointment in technical ops. Effective immediately, civilian contractor Rowan Hale will act as senior advisor to all power systems operations and training." Murmurs again. Some clapped. A few smiled. Rowan stood in the back, hands folded behind her. She didn't step forward. She didn't need to. She'd never wanted rank, only space to serve. That night, as dusk bled into the compound and the stars flickered over a sky so wide it felt almost sacred, she returned to the bench behind the motor pool. Same tin cup, same boots, same silence. But this time she wasn't alone. 3 soldiers, young, quiet, unsure, approached with toolboxes and notebooks. They didn't ask if they could sit, they simply did. Rowan glanced over. "Lesson starts at 1900, she said, sipping her coffee. No fanfare, No declaration, just a survivor, seated in the stillness, scarred, seen, and finally remembered. Some stories don't need medals to be remembered. They live on through quiet leadership, in calloused hands passing down what manuals never teach, and in those who show up every day not for glory, but because they still believe in duty, even when the world forgets their name. Rowan Hale didn't return to take credit. She came back to make sure no one else walked alone. If her story moved you or reminded you of someone you once served with, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Was there a moment in this story that hit home, a face it brought back? Your voice helps carry these stories forward. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Veteran Biker and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next tribute to those who served with courage and carried the weight long after the battle ended. And don't go just yet. There are more powerful veteran stories waiting for you right here on screen. Pick one, and we'll see you in the next ride. Thank you for being part of this journey, Veteran Biker, where honor rides on.